So in the last podcast, we kind of did a general overview of the chart of accounts and overview of how to account for some of the costs and what I think are the three major costs or costs that really make or break a winery. And again, the main one for almost every industry I've ever seen is labor. So we're going to talk about the cost of labor today. And I'll just start off by saying, in general, there's a percentage of your payroll to your gross revenue that you should try to be meeting. So, for example, if you have $1 million of gross revenue, your payroll, and again, this is just general, not for the winery, but for in general, should be about 15% of gross revenue or 150,000. In some industries, it's higher. It's not usually lower than that unless you are in a really non-labor intensive industry, but 15% is a pretty good number, and 20% is acceptable in industries. If you're above 20%, it's either industry specific or your payroll is just too high. But what goes into that number? What goes into your cost of labor? And that's going to be different for every industry. So for a winery, for example, most accountants will set up your chart of accounts, as we discussed last time, with the generic account called payroll expense, and everything that you pay out in payroll will be accounted for under payroll expense. So your vineyard manager and vineyard staff, if you have a vineyard, is going to go under payroll expense. Your tasting room staff is going to go under payroll expense. Your accounting person's payroll expense. Your office manager, your salesperson, payroll. Everything's going to go into payroll expense. That's not necessarily the best place for it to go. Again, for an accountant or a CPA doing your taxes, that's great for them because that's what they have to report on the taxes. And they don't necessarily care if the tasting room labor is mingled with the accounting labor, which is mingled with the vineyard labor. They just don't care. They want to put down the total payroll expense because that's what the taxes require of them. But for you, the owner, you really want to know that your tasting room labor is X amount because you want to match that up with your tasting room revenue. So this is where having an accountant or someone that knows what they're doing is helpful because they can come in and allocate your labor to the correct costs. And this also takes into effect, like, what about the owner? Does the owner get paid? This is a tax issue, but if you have a certain structure like an S Corp or something like that, the IRS will require that you get paid a salary. And guess what? That salary is going to come out of payroll expense. If you just have a regular, hey, this is just in my name business, it's not a LLC or whatever, which is probably pretty rare. An LLC will flow through to you, so you just take a draw. It's just whatever's left over at the end you're getting as your income. So that would not go under payroll expense because no payroll was actually issued to you. You just had a flow through to your to a K1. Tax issues aside, that's irrelevant for this discussion, but just keep in mind that if you, the owner, have to pay yourself a W-2 and a check, it's going to come out of payroll expense, and that should probably be allocated elsewhere at the end of whatever reporting period you want, every quarter or every year or every month, whatever you want to do, but you need to take that out if you're getting paid. Some other things that you want to allocate out would be the vineyard staff. So anything that goes into the cost of growing grapes, the cost of making the wine, any labor that is involved in that, you want to move that up to the growing costs or the cost of goods sold. So your winemaker pay, if that's not you, the owner, should be allocated up to the cost of goods sold of winemaking so that you know, okay, here's how much it costs me to make my wine. Here's how much, your objective is to try to get to, I know that it costs me $5.45 for one bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon, whatever. You really want to know that number. And if you don't allocate the vineyard labor and the winemaking labor to that cost of goods sold, you're not going to get a real number. So in the same token, the tasting room, if you have a separate account for tasting room, you want to allocate the labor to that account. Again, if you don't, then payroll expense is fine, but really you want to try to keep your, at least in my opinion, your tasting room revenue and your tasting room expense separate so that you can see if your tasting room is successful or not. So what labor does fall into the labor account that you really want to keep at 15%? Well, it's mainly your overhead. The question might be, okay, well, I have a salesperson. Do I want to allocate that expense to marketing? You don't have to. I mean, it's not going to tell you a whole lot more. We'll go over, how to assess whether a salesperson is worth having or not in the next podcast. But I would just leave the salesperson payroll in payroll expense. But it would be your accounting staff, your office manager, your general manager if you have one, and any other overhead staff that's not involved either in the tasting room or the growing, making, and bottling of wine. So you might say, well, what about my wine club? I don't know who's doing your wine club shipments, but most of the time that's handled out of the tasting room, but you might have a separate staff doing wine club. I would probably not include the wine club staff or labor in the payroll expense for this analysis. So really you're trying to get your overhead, and if you are not as the owner, you're not included in payroll expense, then it's going to be a lower percentage. So again, you should be with your overhead somewhere around 15%, and it could even be lower depending on what you're doing. And it probably should be a little lower than that if you've allocated the tasting room and the labor from the growing cost. But that'll tell you a really good idea of, am I spending too much on people to help me run my winery? So it's a nice number to have. Obviously, the smaller you are, probably going to be going higher just because you're not generating enough revenue to have a lower percentage. The bigger you are, the more efficient you should be. So if you have $5 million in revenue, I would definitely think you should be at the 15% or lower number. And some people will say, well, what about if I have a California winery? Labor is way more expensive in California. Well, that really shouldn't make a difference, because if you're a California winery, you ought to be charging more for your wine because it's expected. I mean, California is expensive, so people in California are more likely to spend $30 on a bottle of wine than, say, someone in, Texas. So it really should even itself out. Even if you're in an expensive region versus an inexpensive region, that shouldn't impact your percentage at all. It might if you're not adjusting your price, but that should play out in, okay, it costs me more to make my wine, so I need to charge more for my wine. So that should be an analysis that takes place in terms of determining your pricing for your wine, which was a discussion about revenue, and not something I'm going to go over here again because we already discussed it. So there's probably some, and again, not the owner of the winery, but as you probably know, there are certain jobs that have to be done for any winery, and excluding the fact if you're not growing your own grapes, if you do have a vineyard, you need a vineyard manager. You need someone out there putting in the time to grow the grapes. You obviously need a winemaker. You're going to need a general manager, someone overseeing the whole operation. You're going to need an office manager, someone that's filing paperwork, answering the phones, and doing stuff like that. You probably need an accounting function of some sort. You may want a salesperson. I don't recommend it, but you may want one anyway. So there's sales. You're going to have your tasting room staff. And depending on what other things your winery is doing, you might have some other staff. But those are the kind of the key positions. You need someone to grow the grapes, someone to make the wine, someone to oversee the whole operation, the general manager, someone to manage your tasting room, just some support staff in the office, and an accounting person. And again, in a small winery, and this could be up to $5 million, the owner may be doing 2 of those roles. You may have a general manager that's doing 3 of the roles. The general manager may be trying to do the accounting and trying to do sales. I wouldn't recommend your vineyard manager trying to do accounting, but hey, if they can do both, great. I just don't think I've ever seen that before, but the reality is they're going to be doing multiple jobs in a small winery. The one area that I've seen the most common, and not just in wineries, is trying to have your office manager also be your accountant. And this has usually ended in disaster for most companies. And I'm not saying that office managers can't do bookkeeping. It's that they can't analyze the numbers to give good information to the owner to make decisions. They're just doing data entry. Now, they can do the data entry all day long, but you still need someone to come in and say, okay, here's the procedures you want to use. Here's how they want to enter, because data entry could be wrong. It could be putting an expense in the wrong account and really make a mess of things. But if there's a good procedure, there's no reason why the office manager couldn't do data entry, bookkeeping. But you do want someone that can analyze the numbers and help with that aspect. I don't recommend right from the start, or if you haven't had, how would I say this? If I'm an owner of a winery and I think I have problems and my current structure is an office manager bookkeeper, and then I have a person doing my taxes, and I think that there's a problem, I would first start looking at like, well, why is my office manager doing the accounting bookkeeping as well? Again, that should get changed. Someone should come in and look at what's going on and say, okay, your procedures are all wrong. So that usually ends up being an area where problems arise unless it's set up correctly at the beginning. And just because you had your tax CPA set it up correctly in the beginning, as I said in the last podcast, doesn't mean it was. It just means they set it up so that they could do your taxes quickly. So again, that would be the first place I would look if I were coming in to do some consulting for a winery. If there's a problem, it's like, well, your office manager doesn't know anything about accounting and isn't giving you good numbers, good information to make decisions. But the reality is you're going to have people doing crossover roles, and what those roles are, let's hope that they're good at them. Another example of this is your tasting room manager. As I said in the revenue side of the podcast, if you have a tasting room, you are in the retail sales business, which means you need a tasting room manager who just doesn't know about wine. They know how to sell things. They know about merchandising. Merchandising is the ability to display items, understand pricing, and get people to buy things. It is a skill set. It's not something that people just have or don't have. It's something that they've learned by working in retail. There are some people that can intuitively say this looks more attractive or whatever, but merchandising is a skill set that you want to have in your tasting room manager. And I don't often see that from tasting room managers. I usually see a very friendly person that can talk about the wine, but doesn't necessarily know how to sell products. And again, when you are in the retail sales business, that's a pretty important thing to understand. I'm trying to sell wine, but I can also sell other products, and having a knowledgeable person about wine is not necessarily the best thing to have. It might be better to have someone that's not your interaction with the customer, but understands like, how do I want this to look? What's the flow of traffic into my store? What's the flow of traffic outside of my store? Who's going to see my store? That's all something that a tasting room manager would usually handle. And if they don't understand merchandising, they're going to get it wrong. And that could be disastrous for your tasting room. So there are certain skills that you don't want to cross over. Again, I've seen, general managers who are also the winemakers, but then they're out there trying to do marketing. And it's like, you're good at making wine, but you're not so good at selling that wine. So again, if you're going to do crossover stuff, make sure that the person that's doing the crossover tasks can do both of those tasks or all three of the tasks, as opposed to, well, we just don't have anybody, so let's have them do that. That's not going to work. And you as the owner should be doing one of the tasks. If you're just an owner and hiring people, that's fine, but just make sure that it's like, okay, your labor costs are going to be higher because you're not actively involved in the day-to-day operations. If you are involved in the day-to-day operations, then find your strength and hire people around you to help you where you're weak. Like I said in the last podcast, don't try to do everything. Find people to help you be successful, because that will make you more successful. So the last podcast I'm going to do next time is just covering the last two costs or expenses of a winery that I think are the most critical, which would be the cost of goods sold, the whole growing, bottling, making of the wine, and the marketing of that wine. So I will see you next time.